Today we're tackling a concept that's, well, pretty fundamental to how we understand pretty much everything, causation.
Right. How things cause other things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our guide for this is the Abstractionists' Papers by Luiz von Paumgartten. It offers a really fresh way of looking at cause and effect.
It really does. If you're tuning in, you probably like getting to grips with complex ideas, thoroughly, but also kind of quickly.
Yeah, and this definitely fits the bill. It's a different angle.
Absolutely. This isn't just revisiting the same old definitions. The Abstractionist Papers lays out this distinctive framework for understanding influence. It really makes you rethink some standard assumptions.
Totally. So our mission today, our goal for this deep dive, is to really get under the hood of this. What is causation, according to these papers?
How does it actually work in this model?
Yeah, and what's new about it? What does it help you, the listener, understand better about, well, the world?
Okay, let's jump in.
Right. So a core idea, maybe the foundational one, is this split between causation, which happens in what they call the blue space, and interpretation.
Which is in the red space.
Okay, blue and red. What's the crucial difference there? What do we need to get straight away?
Well, the key is where they operate and what they are. Causation, blue space, that's all about interaction, direct influence.
Like physics, pushing something, chemical reactions.
Yeah, any process where one thing acts on another, that's blue space. But interpretation, that's different. It happens inside an individual mind, the red space.
Ah, so that's where we make sense of it all, assign meaning.
Exactly. We take those interactions, those blue space events, and we build our understanding, our meaning in our own red space.
Okay, so like a phone rings, that's the blue space event, right? Shared interaction.
Right.
But how I react, good news, bad news, annoyance. That's my red space interpretation.
Precisely. And someone else might have a completely different red space reaction to the exact same blue space ringing.
The significance is purely internal then.
That's the idea. And what's really interesting is how these two connect, because obviously they do. The papers talk about induction being the bridge.
Induction, okay, how does that work? Linking the blue and the red.
Well, the idea is a causal event, blue space stuff. It doesn't just, teleport a meaning into your head.
Yeah.
Instead, it induces an interpretation within your red space. It triggers something based on your existing mental setup.
Like a key turning a lock. The event fits something already there.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. The causal event triggers a response within your framework, and critically, that interpretation, that red space event, it's not the end.
Ah, right. It leads to behavior, thoughts.
Exactly. Which can then become actions that re-enter the blue space, a new causal factor.
Creating a loop. Interaction, interpretation, interaction.
It's this constant recursive loop of response. And that's a key point. We're not just watching cause and effect passively. Our internal interpretations feed back into and shape the causal world.
Okay. And the papers argue this bluer distinction is sharper, more useful than things like subjective-objective.
Yeah, or physical versus abstract. Why do they say that?
Well, I think the argument is those older divides get messy. Subjective experience is still about something objective, right? And objective reality is still perceived subjectively. A blur.
Yeah. This blue-red split tries for a cleaner cut based on function. Is it interaction itself, blue? Or is it the creation of meaning from it, red?
Okay, that makes sense. Focusing on what's actually happening.
And they suggest that a lot of confusion, paradoxes even, come from mixing these up, applying red space logic to blue space events or vice versa, without realizing they're, different kinds of things.
Orthogonal, I think, is the term they use.
Right, orthogonal. Distinct but linked. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Let's compare it. How we usually think about causation. Often very linear, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. In basic logic, it's A causes B causes C. Simple chain. So what about something like the chicken and egg paradox? How does this framework handle that? We always ask, which came first?
Well, the paper suggests that asking which came first is already trapping yourself in that linear mindset. Causation, in this view, especially in biology, often isn't a straight line. It's a loop, a continuous cycle. Chickens make eggs, eggs make chickens. It's an ongoing dynamic system.
So the paradox comes from our demand for a single starting point, our red space interpretation wanting a simple line.
Exactly. When the blue space reality might be cyclical, the paradox is in the interpretation, not the world.
That's a neat way to look at it. What about philosophical metaphors, like Plato's cave or the Matrix? How does this compare?
Though they're interesting comparisons, both Plato's cave and the Matrix tend to imply there's one shared illusion.
And one ultimate truth or reality outside it.
Right. Everyone sees the same shadows, or there's one real world Neo wakes up into. But the Abstractionist's papers paints a different picture. It suggests many individual minds, each in their own red space, building meaning independently, though in response to the same shared blue space interactions.
So it's not escaping into the same truth.
No. The key quote is something like, "Minds do not escape into the same truth. They build meaning in parallel."
Parallel interpretations of the same shared world, that is different. No single illusion, just different takes.
Which leads to thinking about science versus philosophy. Science often digs into the mechanisms, right?
Yeah, how does gravity work? How does this drug affect cells?
While philosophy often asks why, the reasons, the purpose. Where does this blue-red framework sit with that?
It seems to say the why, our search for meaning, reasons, that's mostly a red space activity, interpretation.
Okay.
But the how, the actual causal processes, the interactions, that's always happening in the blue space, whether we understand it or even notice it.
So it values both, but clearly separates them, encouraging us to look at the how more closely.
Yeah, asking, how did this become possible? Through interaction, not just, why did this happen, in terms of meaning or intent.
Okay, so separating causation blue and interpretation red. What's the payoff? What's the novelty or utility here?
Well, like we touched on, paradox resolution seems key. We did chicken and egg. What about the ship of Theseus?
Ah, yeah, replace every plank, every nail. Is it the same ship?
The text would say the paradox isn't in the physical process of replacement, that's just continuous transformation in the blue space.
It's in our red space concept of sameness or identity applied to something changing.
Exactly. Our mental category of ship struggles with the fluid reality of the causal process. The contradiction is in our interpretation, our attempt to impose a fixed identity.
Wow. Okay, so you dissolve the paradox just by shifting perspective. You don't need to change the science of shipbuilding or physics.
Right. It's about seeing where the contradiction actually lives in the interpretation, not the world. It shifts focus from why is this confusing interpretation to how is this continuous change happening, causation.
That's powerful. It moves the problem. And this connects to causal spaces. What are those?
Think of them as, well, domains with their own rules for how causation works. Physics has its laws. That's one causal space.
Okay.
The rules of chess define another causal space for how pieces interact. Social norms define yet another for how people interact.
Different contexts, different rules of engagement.
Exactly. And understanding these helps sort out inconsistencies when we, say, apply the rules of one space to another inappropriately, like the liar's paradox. This statement is false.
How does that fit?
The paradox arises because the statement tries to operate within a logical causal space, where statements have truth values, but breaks its own rules of reference. The inconsistency is within that specific logical space's rules.
Got it. And this loops back to that orthogonality of domains idea again. Blue and red are orthogonal. Why is that concept so central?
It's crucial because it emphasizes they operate on different axes, you could say. Our red space thoughts, interpretations, they have their own logic. It's not the same logic as blue space interactions.
But they influence each other.
Absolutely. Interpretation red leads to action, blue, which causes new events, blue, which induce new interpretations, red. They move together, they're linked, but they don't mix their fundamental rules.
Trying to map one directly onto the other causes the problems.
That seems to be the argument. That's where confusion and paradoxes often come from.
Okay, let's dig into some key distinctions they make. We've mentioned why versus how. Why emphasize the how so much?
Well, the papers argue we humans are kind of obsessed with why, aren't we? We want reasons, stories, closure.
Yeah, it feels more satisfying.
Definitely. But those why answers, important as they are for our red space understanding and motivation, they don't always tell you about the underlying blue space mechanics.
The actual causal chain or web.
Right. The how. The sequence of interactions and conditions that made something possible that's always there, even if we ignore it or don't get it. Focusing on how gives a more fundamental grip on the dynamics. Might be more useful for prediction, too.
And you mentioned web versus chain. The usual idea is a causal chain, A to B to C, why a web.
The chain metaphor is too simple, often. It implies one direct cause, one direct effect. Reality is messier.
More interconnected.
Yeah, the web captures that better. Multiple factors influence an outcome. Effects ripple outwards. Actions have unintended consequences elsewhere in the web. It's about dynamic interplay, not just a single line.
Makes sense. And then there's direct causation versus inducement. What's that distinction?
Direct causation is like, we'll push a button, light comes on, Direct force, immediate effect.
Okay, straightforward.
Inducement is more subtle. It's about setting the conditions for a response to happen within something else.
Ah, like the yawn example you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Seeing someone yawn doesn't force you to yawn, but it creates the condition, it induces the yawn response if you're susceptible, it triggers something already present in the system.
So causation often works by prompting a response rather than imposing an outcome directly.
That seems to be a key part of the framework, yeah. Especially when minds and interpretations are involved.
Okay, now what about incoherence and coherence? These sound important for understanding change.
Right, so coherence is when things within a specific causal space are running smoothly, following the rules of that space, predictable, harmonious maybe?
Like physics working as expected.
Yeah. Incoherence, though they use that delta symbol, that's when something happens that doesn't quite fit the existing rules. It's an orthogonal shift. Something unexpected enters the system.
Okay, a disruption. And why is that important? How does it drive change?
Because it creates friction, a resistance. They call it causal impedance. When things get too incoherent, too messy, according to the current rules.
The system strains.
Yeah, it creates pressure to reorganize, maybe find new rules, jump to a new way of operating. It can lead to the emergence of entirely new causal spaces.
Like a scientific revolution, anomalies pile up, incoherence, until a new paradigm emerges.
That's a perfect example. And the papers even suggest that paradox itself, experienced in the mind, is like internal incoherence. It's our mind detecting a contradiction, which prompts us to find a new, more coherent understanding.
So paradox isn't just annoying, it's a sign the mind is working, trying to resolve incoherence.
Kind of, yeah. The ordinary condition of a mind at work, I think, is a phrase used. Detecting contradiction and responding.
Okay, let's just quickly recap the red and blue spaces, make sure we've got that solid. Red space is
everything available to an individual mind. Thoughts, memories, feelings, perceptions. Your entire subjective experience. Crucially, this includes your interpretation of what you consider the objective world.
Okay, so objective perception is still a red space phenomenon. And blue space?
That's the shared causation domain, where the actual interactions happen between things. It's objective in the sense that it's common, shared ground for those interactions, even if we each experience its effects differently via our red space.
And reality, as we experience it, happens at the intersection of these two, the orthogonal meeting point.
Exactly. The interactions out there in the blue space, interpreted in here in the red space, that interplay is our experienced reality.
And what we usually call stable, objective reality. The papers suggest that's more about our red space interpretations being closely aligned.
Yeah, when lots of individual red spaces build models that work well together, predict interactions consistently. We call that objective. It's useful, practical alignment.
But not necessarily a direct window onto some fundamental external truth. Each mind is still constructing its own model based on blue space inputs and its own red space rules.
Precisely. When the models overlap enough, we get shared experience and label it objective.
Okay, so bringing it all together, how does this whole framework, this blue-red induction web, how versus why, how does it ultimately help with those paradoxes we started with?
I think the core move is always separating the domains. Recognizing that paradoxes usually pop up when we apply red space logic, linear, fixed identities, y, to blue space processes, often looping, fluid, how.
It's a category error, essentially.
Yeah. So by shifting perspective, seeing the loop in the chicken egg, seeing continuous transformation in the ship of Theseus, understanding induction, not direct force, we see the contradiction wasn't in the blue space world itself.
It was in our red space attempt to map it with inadequate tools.
Exactly, yeah. The contradiction lives in the interpretation. Dissolving it doesn't change the world, just our understanding of it.
That's a really elegant way to think about it. Okay, so to quickly summarize this deep dive on causation from the Abstractionists' papers.
We've hit the big points.
Yeah.
That key distinction between blue space causation and interaction and red space interpretation meaning.
The role of induction as the bridge. Causality as a dynamic web, not just a simple chain.
The shift from asking only why to really digging into how, and crucially, how changing our perspective, understanding these distinctions, can help dissolve paradoxes.
It's a really comprehensive framework.
Absolutely. And hopefully, this gives you, our listener, a new lens to think about cause and effect maybe in your own life, or just watching the news, whatever. It's a different way to frame things.
And if you want to go deeper, the source material, the Abstractionists' papers, is available free online. Welcome to thebluespace.com.
Definitely worth checking out if this sparked your interest.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Could it be that many of the big, really stuck problems we face, disagreements, misunderstandings, conflicts, could they stem, at least partly, from fundamentally misunderstanding this orthogonal relationship, from confusing the underlying causal interactions with our own, often very different interpretations of them?
That's definitely something to chew on. A lot of conflict seems to be about people living in different interpretive realities based on the same events.
Something to think about.